In the early days of World War II, Britain stood alone against the might of Nazi Germany. The skies over Europe were filled with the roar of engines, the thundering sound of German bombers, and the relentless assault of fighter aircraft. At the same time, the RAF was fighting not only for their survival, but for the future of freedom itself. Britain's survival hinged on its ability to defend itself from German air superiority, a superiority that was seemingly unshakable. The Luftwaffe, Hitler's air force, had dominated European skies for months, striking relentlessly at targets across Britain. The year is 1940. The Battle of Britain is in full swing, and the Luftwaffe is determined to break Britain. Day after day, waves of German bombers, protected by fighter escorts, descend on British cities. The British Royal Air Force, under the leadership of Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, is vastly outnumbered. With fewer planes, limited resources, and a rapidly depleting number of pilots, the RAF must find a way to hold back the Germans before it's too late. The problem isn't just that the Luftwaffe has more planes. It's that the Luftwaffe is flying smarter. They have been trained in highly disciplined tactics, with coordinated formations, clear communication, and precise timing. German pilots know the value of patience. They wait until the perfect moment to strike, often waiting until they have the most vulnerable target in their sights before pulling the trigger. The RAF, on the other hand, is forced to adapt, to find a way to level the playing field, to make up for what they lack in numbers and firepower with innovation. But what if, instead of waiting for that perfect shot, the RAF could turn the tables on the Germans? What if, rather than waiting to see the enemy clearly, British pilots could take control of the situation, anticipating their opponent's movements and striking first? It was a concept that seemed impossible at first, but in the direst of circumstances, British pilots began to develop a strategy that would fundamentally change the way air combat was fought. The tactic was simple yet revolutionary: fire before you see the enemy. This wasn't just some desperate strategy used by pilots when their backs were against the wall. It became the key to the RAF's survival, enabling them to fight against overwhelming odds and eventually win the Battle of Britain. By firing first, pilots forced the Germans into a position where they couldn't anticipate the attack. It disrupted the Germans' carefully constructed dogfighting strategy and, in many cases, made the difference between life and death for the pilots involved. In this script, we'll explore the daring strategy of British pilots firing before they could see their enemies, how it came to be, how it evolved, and how it gave them the edge they needed to not just survive, but ultimately defeat one of the most powerful air forces in the world. This tactical shift didn't just win dogfights, it changed the rules of aerial combat for good. As we dive deeper into the story, you'll see how this unconventional approach came to define British air superiority during Hauptsache and set the stage for modern air combat. It's a story of ingenuity, courage, and the relentless will to survive against all odds. The Battle of Britain had begun in earnest, and the odds were heavily stacked against the Royal Air Force. The Luftwaffe had one of the largest, most efficient air forces in the world, and they were backed by years of experience. Their tactics were highly coordinated and precise, and they had the advantage of superior numbers and better aircraft at the start of the conflict. In contrast, the RAF was vastly outnumbered, operating with aging aircraft, insufficient resources, and perhaps most critically, a shortage of trained pilots. At the onset of the war, Britain had relied on a handful of methods to counter the Luftwaffe's bombing raids. The chain-home radar system was one of their most valuable assets. It provided an early warning of incoming airstrikes, allowing the RAF to scramble fighters to intercept the German bombers. However, despite its effectiveness in detecting enemy aircraft, the radar system had limitations. It could only detect enemy planes at high altitudes and was ineffective at tracking smaller, more agile fighter aircraft. The RAF's fighter planes, including the Supermarine Spitfire and the Hawker Hurricane, were excellent machines in their own right, but the sheer numbers of enemy bombers and fighters posed a massive problem. The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, was equipped with the Messerschmitt Bf 109, one of the most formidable fighters of the war, and had the upper hand in terms of both speed and firepower. Initially, the RAF tried to meet the German threat by engaging in traditional air combat tactics. British pilots followed the established dogfighting protocol, engage the enemy head-on, aim carefully, and wait for the right moment to strike. But this approach quickly proved insufficient. The German pilots had mastered the art of hit-and-run tactics, diving in quickly, firing a few shots, and then peeling away before the RAF could respond. In the early weeks of the Battle of Britain, this strategy led to heavy losses for the RAF. Pilots found themselves caught off guard in the air, unable to get a clean shot at the Germans before they were forced to break off the engagement. German bombers came in waves, and their fighter escorts, the Bf-109s, would often engage the British fighters in head-to-head dogfights, giving them little time to retaliate. To make matters worse, the RAF was not always able to replenish its fighter squadrons as quickly as the Luftwaffe could replace their losses. This logistical nightmare, combined with the Germans' superior tactics and weaponry, meant that the British pilots were quickly becoming overwhelmed. The RAF's high command was under pressure to come up with a solution, and they had little time to make adjustments. The losses were mounting, and if something wasn't done soon, Britain's air defenses would be completely overrun. Amidst this intense pressure, the RAF needed to change their approach to air combat, and fast. The standard doctrine of waiting for a clear shot was no longer viable. British pilots had to find a way to strike first, and with devastating effect. At first, this idea was radical. The very thought of firing before seeing the enemy went against established military thinking. Air combat doctrine up until this point had emphasized careful targeting and waiting for the optimal shot. But in a desperate situation like the one the RAF faced, some pilots began to experiment with breaking the rules. One of the first to recognize the potential of firing before seeing was Group Captain Douglas Bader, one of the most famous RAF pilots of the war. Bader, who had lost both his legs in an accident prior to the war but still flew, was known for his bold tactics and aggressive approach to dogfighting. He had the mental agility to come up with tactics that went against the grain of conventional wisdom. Bader and his fellow pilots noticed that the Germans often tried to wait until they were in the perfect position to shoot, while British pilots were forced to react to their attacks, often too late. Bader began to push the idea of anticipating the enemy's movements, using speed and surprise to overcome the German advantage. But this new approach required more than just a few pilots willing to take risks. It needed to be ingrained in the RAF's air combat strategy, and the only way to make that happen was through training and adaptation. This is when a bold new tactic began to take shape: fire first, fire fast, and fire often. Instead of waiting until the enemy was directly in their sights, British pilots began to shoot at the enemy before they were fully visible, anticipating where the Germans would be. The idea was to catch the Germans off guard, hitting them before they could even react. It wasn't just about the timing of the shot. Pilots were now also learning to anticipate their targets' flight paths and firing their guns in rapid bursts to throw the Germans off. This change in tactics was driven not only by necessity, but by an emerging understanding of psychological warfare. The Germans were highly disciplined pilots, but even they were vulnerable to disruption. If they couldn't predict where their opponents were shooting from, it threw off their rhythm and increased the risk of getting hit. As the RAF began to refine this tactic, it became clear that firing first was not just a reaction, it was a psychological weapon. For pilots, the ability to take the initiative in a dogfight gave them a tactical edge that allowed them to disrupt the Germans' discipline. It was no longer about waiting for the perfect shot. Instead, it was about pressure and momentum, forcing the enemy to react to your actions, not the other way around. Pilots began to rely on instinct and trained reflexes. They understood that a split-second decision to fire before seeing their enemy could make the difference between life and death. RAF instructors started focusing on developing these intuitive skills in their trainees. They taught pilots to trust their instincts and fire at target areas they anticipated, even if they couldn't see the enemy clearly. This adaptation also led to the development of new strategies during dogfights. Pilots began flying in more aggressive formations, using coordinated attacks to overwhelm the Germans. With the element of surprise now on their side, the RAF was able to make the most of every opportunity in the skies. They didn't wait for perfect shots. They took the shots that presented themselves, constantly staying in the fight. What this tactic also did was increase reaction speed. The more British pilots practiced anticipating the enemy's movements and firing early, the faster they became at making decisions during intense dogfights. Their instincts sharpened, and their ability to process information while in combat became more reliable. What started as a small shift in tactics evolved into a crucial part of RAF training, one that helped them adapt to the relentless pace of aerial warfare. As the strategy gained momentum, it became clear that firing first was no longer an experiment. It was a proven method that led to greater accuracy and higher kill rates. British pilots began to realize they could win more dogfights by staying on the offensive rather than reacting defensively. Instead of letting the Germans dictate the flow of combat, they were now able to set the pace. As the Battle of Britain intensified, the RAF had no choice but to continue evolving and adapting its strategies. The pressure was mounting, and the situation was dire. Germany's air force was outnumbering the RAF in the sky, and the relentless bombing raids were threatening to break Britain's will to fight. British pilots were learning that they could not afford to wait for the perfect shot. They had to act fast, take risks, and anticipate the enemy's movements. The firing first tactic, which had started as a small innovation among a few daring pilots, was quickly becoming a cornerstone of RAF strategy. With Group Captain Douglas Bader pushing the idea of preemptive strikes, the RAF began training their pilots to shoot before they could see their enemy, a tactic that would eventually become standard in dogfighting. In this section, we'll explore how this tactic was implemented, the real-world tests that proved its effectiveness, and how it turned the tide in the Battle of Britain. The summer of 1940 saw some of the most intense air combat of the war. The Luftwaffe had launched an all-out assault on Britain with the goal of destroying the RAF and paving the way for a German invasion of the British Isles. The battle was, quite literally, a fight for survival. With the odds stacked against them, the RAF needed every edge they could get. In the early days of the battle, British pilots struggled to keep up with the superior numbers of German bombers and their fighter escorts. The Germans had established a highly efficient system of bombing raids and fighter support, which allowed them to focus on one target at a time. The RAF, meanwhile, had to defend against these waves with fewer resources, fewer planes, and fewer pilots. But the firing first tactic began to shift the balance. RAF pilots, now trained in the art of anticipation, no longer waited for the Germans to get the first shot. Instead, they actively engaged the enemy early on, taking the fight to the Germans instead of waiting for them to dictate the terms of combat. By firing before they could even see their enemy clearly, British pilots forced the Luftwaffe pilots to react, disrupting their timing and throwing them off balance. The results were immediate. German bombers and escort fighters found themselves under constant pressure. For the first time, the Luftwaffe pilots could not rely on their usual tactics of waiting for the perfect position. Instead, they were met with a barrage of bullets from RAF planes they couldn't even see. This disrupted their formations, and in many cases, it allowed the RAF to target their bombers before they could even release their payload. The Battle of Britain quickly became a test of initiative. The RAF pilots who had adopted the tactic of firing first gained a decisive edge. The Germans were unable to adapt quickly enough, and their bombing campaigns began to falter. By the end of August 1940, the Luftwaffe had failed to break the RAF, and Britain had won the first major victory in the air. This was a turning point in the war, and it was made possible by a simple but revolutionary change in how combat was approached. One of the key reasons that the firing first tactic worked so well was the psychological advantage it gave to British pilots. The Luftwaffe was trained to fight with precision and discipline. They waited for the right moment to strike, often choosing the most vulnerable moments in their enemy's flight. British pilots, on the other hand, had the benefit of not waiting for that perfect shot. Instead, they used their instinct and intuition, relying on training and anticipation to get the jump on the Germans. This created a psychological advantage for the RAF. German pilots, who were accustomed to waiting for the perfect target, found themselves constantly reacting to British attacks, which created confusion and disarray in their formations. The unpredictability of the British attacks made it hard for the Germans to get a solid lock on their targets, and it forced them into reactive combat rather than offensive strikes. By the time the German pilots realized they had been hit, they were already retreating. This psychological disruption became a crucial element of the RAF's dogfighting success. British pilots, once uncertain and outnumbered, were now pushing the Luftwaffe to adapt to their tactics and pace of combat. The success of this tactic wasn't just about firing first, it was about firing with confidence and maintaining the initiative throughout the engagement. The more the British pilots used this tactic, the more they were able to disorient and outmaneuver their German counterparts. The psychological effects of this tactic were profound, and they gave British pilots the upper hand in the most critical air battles of the war. Once the effectiveness of the firing first tactic became evident, the RAF quickly began incorporating it into their standard training. New recruits were taught how to anticipate the enemy's movements, how to position themselves for early engagement, and how to fire quickly and accurately, even when the enemy wasn't clearly visible. This was a marked departure from traditional dogfighting tactics, which emphasized careful aim and precise targeting. The new training regimen was focused not just on aerial combat skills, but also on psychological conditioning. Pilots had to learn how to trust their instincts, react quickly, and not hesitate. The concept of anticipation became a core part of the RAF's fighter tactics, and it was emphasized in every training exercise. The goal was to ensure that every pilot had the ability to think on their feet and take control of the situation, even when they were under heavy pressure. RAF flight schools began to integrate realistic combat scenarios into their training, using mock dogfights to teach pilots the intricacies of firing first and engaging the enemy before they could react. They were also trained to counter the tactics of the Luftwaffe, learning how to evade German attacks while maintaining offensive pressure. This created a generation of pilots who were not only skilled in combat, but also capable of psychological warfare, throwing their opponents off balance before the battle even began. As the Battle of Britain raged on, the RAF's adoption of the firing first tactic proved to be a game changer. British pilots became more aggressive, more confident, and more relentless in their pursuit of victory. The German pilots, who had been trained to rely on waiting for the perfect shot, found themselves caught off guard time and again. The more the British pilots pushed this tactic, the more successful they became. German bombers and fighters were being shot down at an alarming rate, and the Luftwaffe began to feel the pressure. By the end of 1940, the RAF had successfully defended Britain. The German Air Force, unable to break through the RAF's defense, was forced to abandon its mission of destroying the British military. The firing first tactic, combined with the RAF's other innovations, played a critical role in that victory. But the legacy of this strategy didn't end with the Battle of Britain. The lessons learned from anticipating the enemy, firing first, and maintaining psychological pressure would continue to shape air combat throughout W2. The tactic was used in other major battles, from the North African campaign to the D-Day invasion, and became a hallmark of RAF fighter tactics for the remainder of the war. The tactic of firing first may have seemed like a small adjustment, but it turned out to be one of the most revolutionary changes in the history of aerial combat. By taking control of the skies, British pilots no longer waited for the Germans to dictate the pace of the battle. They created their own opportunities and forced the enemy to play by their rules. The success of this strategy proved that in war, sometimes the boldest tactics are the most effective. And in the case of British pilots, firing before seeing the enemy wasn't just an act of desperation. It was the key to winning more dogfights, gaining air superiority, and ultimately defending Britain from the onslaught of the Luftwaffe. Today, the firing first tactic is still relevant in modern military aviation. The principles of anticipation, quick decision-making, and maintaining the initiative remain core components of fighter tactics. The RAF pilots who pioneered this strategy didn't just change the course of the Battle of Britain, they changed the entire way air combat was fought.